Hello, everyone. Jonathan Alexander here with the Los Angeles Review of Books. And I am delighted to have today as my guest on Writing Sex, William E. Jones. William E. Jones is an artist, filmmaker, and a writer, and has had a very long and distinguished career in art and filmmaking. I am here today to talk with him specifically about two of his most recent books, the novels I Am Open to Anything, which was published in 2019, and I Should Have Known Better, which came out just late last year. William, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome.
So I have to admit, I am an unabashed fan of these books. I think they're absolutely delightful. They're perverse in all of the best ways. They chronicle a young person sort of coming up of age, coming into real sexual maturity in the 70s and 80s, and also developing as an artist. And so I have to ask, of course, about the semi-autobiographical nature of the books, and how did you come to write them?
Well, I decided to narrate them in first person.
Yeah.
And an unfortunate effect of that is that people often take them as autobiographies. It's not an autobiography. The first one is maybe the closest to autobiography, but as the series is going along, it gets farther and farther away from my own life, which for people who know me should be quite obvious. And the other unfortunate thing is, people, they read it and they hear my voice speaking. Because I've used my voice in a number of my films and artistic works, and my voice is known for things like this. And so people hear my voice reading it. I have not done an audiobook yet, but I suppose I should eventually. But the first novel was really almost a prank. I had published a biography of Boyd MacDonald called True Homosexual Experiences through We Heard You Like Books, which is an independent publisher in Los Angeles. And I was meeting with my publisher, and he was so happy with the way True Homosexual Experiences turned out. He just said on a lark, I think from now on, we just should be publishing dirty gay books. And I said, well, I can write you one. And then he said, I'm open to anything. I said, you've just given me the title.
Yeah.
And so the project, as I conceived it, was a porno novel called I'm Open to Anything. Yeah. What would I write with that title? And so I started writing. And my writing actually began with, if I'm not mistaken, the election of Donald Trump. And it was really wild, the manuscript I produced. And then eventually I cut it down. I cut about 100 pages out of it and shaped it into something more disciplined and briefer, and rewrote it. And it became I'm Open to Anything, my first novel. And it actually became rather successful. Within a year's time, we're going to need a third printing of it. Which is quite nice for an independent publication. And something that happened is that readers began to approach me either in email or in person, and they would ask me what happens next. There wasn't enough for them. And I thought, well, I've got to do something more. And I thought I'd just write one novel and be done with it. It would be almost like a practical joke or like an interesting sideline in an artistic career. But I had some demand for further installments. So I thought, well, I'll write a trilogy. And now the first two installments have been published. And the third one, I just finished the second draft of the third novel, which is going to be called I Didn't See It Coming. And it is considerably longer than the other two. I believe it's going to be about 100 pages longer than I'm Open to Anything. So that's really something. I've become a novelist somehow, but I didn't really have that as my original intention.
I love it. And I was careful to say semi-autobiographical because I couldn't help but think that you obviously pulled from some of your experiences as an artist, but I wasn't going to assume, straightforward memoir, but this raises an interesting question for me because I can understand why people would assume the books are memoir-esque. They read in some ways like memoirs, and we're at an interesting moment in writing, particularly writing about sexual subjectivity, where it seems like there's often a fuzzy line between things that seem like memoirs and things that seem like fiction. So I appreciate you playing with that in some ways.
And we also live in a time when our society is given over to all lies all the time.
All the time.
There's constant deception being thrown at us, and we have to figure out how to negotiate this. But one thing I should say, and this is an anecdote, but people often mistake the autobiographical parts and the purely fictional parts. And with the first novel, there's one brief episode where the narrator has a composition teacher who rejects his essay, and he really gets punished. He has to rewrite his essay because the teacher thinks his essay is obscene. This is in high school. And then later on, there's an episode where the narrator is at an art gallery in Berlin, and he sees Jean Genet, and they stand in front of a Caravaggio painting. And everyone assumes that the high school teacher episode was true, that it had really happened to me. And the Caravaggio episode with Jean Genet was totally made up, when in fact it was the opposite.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, that's great.
I made up it wasn't that difficult to make up a getting in trouble with teacher episode. But in fact, the Jean Genet episode, it's so unlikely that it could only be true. Right. And it really did happen to me.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love it. So what we discover is that this narrator, this protagonist, is pursuing, I want to say, at least initially, an avocation. I suspect it will become his vocation with art by the time we get to the second book, and is enrolled in art school, seemingly having stumbled into this. And so there's a way in which the books very much. Okay, this is a crazy connection, but I'm a big fan of the genre of the Bildungsroman, and I can't help but think of Goethe and Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship. I mean, this is a story of an artist coming into maturity in a lot of ways, but they're also deeply perverse because he's not only a budding artist, he's also deeply into fisting. And I would love to know, how are you? Your anecdote about the origin of the books makes total sense now, so I can get where you're coming from. I'd love to hear anything you have to say about the sort of the blending of these potentially very different realms, which somehow in the books seem like they go, no pun intended, hand in hand.
Deeply. Okay, so it's interesting that you bring up the Bildungsroman, because the original way we were going to promote the book, the tagline, as it were, was that I'm open to anything was a pornographic Bildungsroman.
Lovely.
But nobody knew what that meant, so it didn't really work as advertising.
Yeah.
And it's a shame, because it's exactly the right word.
Yeah.
It was exactly what I was thinking of when I was writing it. Yeah. And so I was very interested, very specifically, in this collision of pornography and Bildungsroman. And I was also, you may have been aware of this from reading or listening to something I've said, but I was very interested in Olympia Press and this sort of porn that they published in mid 20th century by very important authors like Jean Genet or William S. Burroughs. And they were things that were considered obscene or pornographic, and they were published in Paris by Maurice Girodias, and they became this amazing series of books. And for me, that was a kind of great inspiration. I'm also thinking about the Enlightenment. I adore Diderot. And I think about how his first novel was actually a porno novel, The Indiscreet Jewels. Yeah. And, this very interesting connection between intellectual life, or let's say the development of an artistic vocation, and flat out pornography. It's something I don't think enough Americans have explored. I think it's more common in continental European fiction than it is in America or England. And this may have something to do with the heritage of Puritanism.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so for me, that really is an important insight about the book. And I needed to continue the further adventures of the narrator and think about what kind of artistic ambitions he could nurture. So he went off to art school in the second novel. And there's always this ambivalence in him between what it means to be an artist and what it means to be a writer.
Right.
And that's actually, I have to confess, it's never resolved in the narrator, as perhaps it's never been resolved in me. And you know, it's this division of labor that our society foists upon us, that being an artist is one kind of activity and being a writer is another kind of activity. I think it causes some people a lot of inconvenience and even pain. And it is really a difficult thing to negotiate if you can do both, make images and make written texts. And you know, for me, the way I first solved that problem was going to film school. I thought, well, I'll be a filmmaker. But the kind of films I was interested in making were not really conventional narrative films. Curiously enough, though, the kind of novels I'm writing are straight ahead narratives. You figure that one out.
True. But I really appreciate your commentary about European tradition here. In addition to publishing Burroughs and Genet, Olympia Press also published Jean Cocteau's The White Paper. And so Cocteau is another, I think, famous example of someone very much like you who is very at home in both the visual field and the textual field as well. And I'm wondering, and curiously enough, someone both like Burroughs and Genet, also incredibly queer in an orientation towards, you know, not just sexual orientation, but towards what he wanted to do, what he envisioned art doing.
Yeah.
I'd love to know a little bit more about how, well, okay, we won't say how you resolve the tension between the two, but your books are, while they're very narrative, they're also loaded with interesting images and feature your artwork, especially on the beautiful cover of the second book. How, you know, so I can't help but ask, if you don't resolve the tension between the two, how do you use each to inspire the other?
Well, that's exactly how I would put it, that one inspires the other. One of the things that happened with the second book, okay, so you know, a little bit of telling tales out of school, the character of Frances, who is a painter in art school that the narrator befriends, she's based upon a friend of mine named Angela Dufresne. And Angela is quite an accomplished painter. And I wrote descriptions of fictional paintings that Frances was working on in the book. And before the book got published, I gave the manuscript to Angela. She read it and started making paintings based upon my fictional descriptions of her work.
I love it.
And in fact, she did an entire exhibition at M&B Fine Art in Los Angeles based upon ideas I came up with for her paintings.
Oh,
and sometimes I would only give her a title. Other times I would fully describe a painting, and she just ransacked it all. And the curious thing was that exhibition happened months before the book came out. So it seems almost as though to a reader who's informed that I was writing descriptions of works that existed.
Yeah.
But in fact, they were imaginary artworks. One thing I can say, and this is a real problem with movies, narrative films have a lot of trouble with artists. I think authors somewhat less so, but there's a real problem with understanding the life of an artist and putting it into a story that's not just parodic or trivial.
Yeah.
And I can't think of a single movie that represents the life of an artist adequately. So part of what's at stake for me in writing these books is to try to represent the texture of the lives of working artists who are, and they're a group of people who, some of whom are quite famous, but I feel like their lives are rather mysterious to a general public. And so there's a certain amount of demystification I'd like to happen. Like, this is actually the way artists live, or lived in Los Angeles in the 90s and early 2000s. Perhaps that kind of life isn't possible anymore. I'm not sure. I've got rent control.
Fair, but I can't help but mention, given that, of course, this series is called Writing Sex, that the books also seem as much a chronicle of kind of sexual mores within a very, very bohemian queer community at the time. And
Right.
that's as much a part of those narratives. So it's interesting that you originally considered them, sort of pornographic Bildungsromane. I love that you're going to continuing that. I would expect that the third volume would have even more sort of boundary pushing self-exploration through the sexual. Is that an adequate way to talk about what you're doing?
Well, I think what happens is there's a transformation in the place of the sexual in the life of the narrator and the lives of his contemporaries.
Yeah.
Because, okay, so between the first novel and the second, it's a gap of only a couple of months in narrative time. And then the gap between the second novel and the third is 6 years. So all of the characters you meet as young people in earlier novels are approaching middle age in the third novel. And then there are other characters who are older. So for older people, sexuality changes.
Right.
And that's actually one of the things that I'm really interested in for I Didn't See It Coming, is attempting to represent sexuality as it evolves, the place of sexuality in the lives of the characters, and how middle-aged people get on with their lives.
Right.
It's all about young people in the first novel.
Yeah.
In the second, it's art school, so it's postponing real life. And in the third, there's no postponing going on. I have to really address how these people live their lives. How do they support themselves? How do they function? How do they have social lives? And one of the things that happens to the narrator at the end of the second novel, and it continues to happen in the third, is that there's an attrition. His friends, one by one, they leave town. And this is very much true to life. I think that, as you get older, the friends you spent all your time with, they find other things to do. They have jobs that are demanding, or they leave town because they found a job somewhere else. And to me, that's a very important part of the narrative arc, so to speak, of the trilogy.
I love it. It makes me eager all the more to get to this book. I don't think we have enough books that really take seriously the movement out of youth into middle age, particularly with
another thing I should say is simultaneously in the third novel, and I think this is really what happens to a lot of people when they reach middle age. Simultaneously, the narrator gets less sex, but he either participates in or witnesses sex that's much more extreme than what he did as a youth.
Oh, interesting. Given the first two books, this will be intriguing.
Well, it's a relative.
It's all a matter of exactly.
Yeah, it's a matter of degree.
Love it.
I love it. Degree.
So
the one thing I will say, this is specifically about sex.
Yeah.
I was not interested in being yet another example of representing fisting as though it's part of BDSM or it's something to do with coercion or sadism, when I believe that actually fisting is an extreme form of intimacy.
Sure.
And it is, it's not easy, but it's also something that can be very tender and really intense.
Yeah.
And it is very, very intimate. And the other thing that's pointed out, that has been pointed out to me, is that it's also not phallocentric.
Right.
That is something that anyone can do as long as they have a hand.
Right.
And all of these nuances to how fisting actually plays out between people, they really haven't been represented in literature as far as I know.
Yeah.
I remember doing a little research and trying to figure out, is there such a thing as a fisting novel? I remember finding Severo Sardui, his book Maitreya, which features a fisting scene, but the way it's written, you can't even tell it's a fisting scene.
What's going on?
Because it's like neo-Baroque Spanish prose. It's almost impossible to tell that it's sex. Whereas I have to say, you can call it a virtue or not. It's totally unambiguous. I write sex scenes.
Right. Right. No, there's no doubt. And they are, I would say they are so themselves intimate and finely drawn. It's hard at times for me not to imagine that you describe fisting as its own kind of sexual orientation. And if not it's not full on orientation, at least it is its own separate kind of intimacy that really should be understood on its own terms, apart from, as you were saying, BDSM rituals or other kinds of sexual activity. Really powerful.
It does have things in common with other forms of sexuality.
And can be part of it, but
I mean, in the case of this narrator, his partners are all men,
right?
And also, it is a form of sexuality which is highly ritualized because a lot of preparation has to take place. But also there's a lot of care so that you don't hurt the partner who's receiving the fist. Right. I mean, this is really an important part of it because and it's not even in porn. I have friends who watch fisting porn and they think, oh, well, that's what it's about. And in fact, if a real scene goes on between two people, it doesn't look anything like that. That's the camera ready version of fisting. And when it's really done, a lot of care has to be taken that you don't harm the person you're with.
Right, right. Love it. So are there things that you're reading, experiencing, could be film, could be music, could be other books, that are really helping to push your understanding of sex, sexuality, intimacy?
Well, it's not about reading so much, but I've been very interested in Twitter lately. Yeah. For a while there, it was considered a little bit beyond the pale to be into Twitter because, of course, it was the empire of Donald Trump.
Right.
But other social media platforms are much more censored. Mm. An important phenomenon that isn't getting a lot of attention is that a lot of particularly gay Instagram accounts are getting censored out of existence. And I'm not talking about people showing hardcore porn on Instagram. I understand why there are rules against that. But, nudity, even in the context of an artistic work. And it seems like the gay guys who have the most interesting sense of humor, who have the most ironic view of the world, are the ones that get punished the most.
Oh, interesting.
Because the bots or the people who are doing the surveillance, they don't understand irony when they see it. They don't understand a sense of humor when they see it.
Right.
And so there are these lovely accounts that I look at and I just think are fascinating, but they're getting censored all the time and they may be banned. Yeah. The one place where you don't get banned is Twitter. And so I look at Twitter.
You're Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, I'm not looking at that kind of account. What I'm seeing are a lot of things that are essentially teasers for OnlyFans or Just for Fans accounts.
Interesting, sure. Yeah.
And it's a very important social trend that has not been fully understood or analyzed or even discovered by a lot of people, but young people are more than ever before commercializing or monetizing their sexuality.
Right.
And I'm a veteran of the porn industry, so I know a thing or two about commercializing one's sexuality. And to me, it's incredible, the numbers of people, the fact that they're devoting their entire lives to making content for an OnlyFans or Just for Fans page, and the Twitter is the teaser for it. And this is really, I think this is leading to something new. I don't know how these people are going to approach middle age, but they're living a youth which is very much under the scrutiny of spectators. And I can't help but think that this has a profound psychological impact on them. And I'm very curious to know what it is. I don't know many people personally who do this kind of thing, but I am getting to know some people actually. And this is something which is, I'm not exactly sure how it's feeding the present trilogy of novels, but it is certainly feeding me intellectually. It's quite an unexpected thing. And, you know, I have to say, in terms of Instagram, I have to be very careful now. I'm not really on Twitter. I don't have an active Twitter account where I'm posting things about my books, but I do use Instagram to promote these novels. And I was very lucky because the statue on the cover of I'm Open to Anything, which has an enormous gold heart on, it didn't get censored by Instagram.
That's stunning. Yeah.
I think the bots were incapable of seeing that it was, they're attuned to look at flesh-colored things.
Right, right.
And because it was gold, they didn't understand that it was a giant erect penis that was in the middle of this picture.
Yeah.
So I've been using these, particularly one account, William E. Jones on Instagram, for promoting the books. And now I'm really scared. I think, my God, I'm going to get banned. I don't know how I'm going to promote these things, because this whole endeavor has been very DIY.
Yeah.
You know, I'm essentially a guy living in Los Angeles with an Instagram account, working with an independent publisher in my town in Los Angeles. And it is as bare bones as possible. But somehow it's been working.
I love it.
And to me, that's actually a very hopeful thing also to say to people, particularly younger people. You can actually do this.
That's right.
You don't have to be mediated by a giant publishing house. You don't have to really kowtow to conventional critical opinion. You can actually publish your own books and they can reach an audience.
That's right.
You've got to be clever about it.
Yeah.
But this can really work in this society at this moment. And to me, that's a very hopeful thing.
I love it. It's a great note to end on. I've been talking with William E. Jones. His 2 novels, I'm Open to Anything and I Should Have Known Better, are soon to be followed by a 3rd. Thank you so much for talking with me. This has been a delight.
Well, thank you for having me.